يا أيها النبي حسبك الله ومن اتبعك من المؤمنين.
O Prophet, Allah is sufficient for you and the believers who follow you.
يا أيها النبي حرض المؤمنين على القتال إن يكن منكم 20 صابرون يغلبوا 200 وإن يكن منكم 100 يغلبوا 1000 من الذين كفروا بأنهم قوم لا يفقهون.
O Prophet, rouse the believers to fighting. If there be 20 of you who persevere, they shall vanquish 200. And if there be of you 100, they shall vanquish 1,000 of those who disbelieve. For they are a people who lack understanding.
What is nowadays called morale has been described as understanding in the Quran. The Quranic expression is more scientific than the currently used word morale. For the word in this context refers to the one who is fully cognizant of his objective, who is quite clear in his mind that the cause for which he has staked his life is much more valuable than his own life. And hence, if that cause is left unrealized, his life will lose all its worth and meaning. Such a conscious, committed person actually becomes many times more powerful than he who fights without any consciousness of his cause, even though the two might be comparable in physical strength. Above all, he who has a clear understanding of the reality of his own being, of God, of his relationship with God, of the reality of life and death, and of life after death, who is also well aware of the difference between truth and falsehood, and the consequences of victory of falsehood over truth, his strength surpasses by far the strength of others for whom, even though they understand, their consciousness is related to nationalism, or patriotism, or class conflict. It is for this reason that the Quran declares that a believer with understanding is 10 times stronger than an unbeliever. For the believer understands the truth, and a non-believer does not. It may be remembered, however, that the verse also mentions another important factor in addition to understanding, which makes a believer much stronger than an unbeliever, and that is patience.
الآن خفف الله عنكم وعلم أن فيكم ضعفا فإن يكن منكم 100 صابرة يغلبوا 200 وإن يكن منكم 1000 يغلبوا 2000 بإذن الله والله مع الصابرين.
Allah has now lightened your burden, for He found weakness in you. So if there be 100 of you who persevere, they shall vanquish 200. And if there be 1,000 of you, they shall, by the leave of Allah, vanquish 2,000. Allah is with those who persevere. They shall, by the leave of Allah, vanquish 2,000.
This does not mean that since the faith of Muslims had declined, their 10 times superiority over the unbelievers had been reduced to twice only. What it means is that ideally a Muslim is 10 times stronger than an unbeliever. However, since the Muslims had not as yet been thoroughly trained and had not reached the desired level of maturity in their understanding, they are asked not to feel uneasy, at least of challenging an enemy which is twice as strong. It should be borne in mind that the Quranic directive was given in 2 after Hijri, 624 CE, when most of the Muslims, being recent converts to Islam, had undergone little training. As they gained maturity under the Prophet's guidance, the desired ratio of 1 to 10 between the Muslims and the unbelievers was established. That Muslims are 10 times stronger than unbelievers is a fact witnessed frequently in the battles during the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and of the rightly guided caliphs.
ما كان لنبي أن يكون له أسرى حتى يثخن في الأرض تريدون عرض الدنيا والله يريد الآخرة والله عزيز حكيم.
It behoves not a prophet to take captives until he has sufficiently suppressed the enemies in the land. You merely seek the gains of the world, whereas Allah desires for you the good of the hereafter. Allah is Almighty, All-Wise.
لولا كتاب من الله سبق لمسكم فيما أخذتم عذاب عظيم.
Had there not been a previous decree from Allah, a stern punishment would have afflicted you for what you have taken.
فكلوا مما غنمتم حلالا طيبا واتقوا الله إن الله غفور رحيم.
So eat that which you have obtained, for it is lawful and clean, and fear Allah. Surely Allah is ever forgiving, most merciful. So eat that which you have obtained, for it is lawful and clean, and fear Allah.
In attempting to explain the circumstantial background of the above verse, some commentators on the Quran have referred to the deliberations for deciding the fate of the Quraysh captives after the Battle of Badr. In that council, Abu Bakr pleaded to release the captives in return for ransom, while Umar suggested that they should be put to the sword. Preferring Abu Bakr's suggestion, the Prophet, peace be upon him, set all the captives free in return for ransom. However, God disapproved the decision, as is evident from the above quoted verse. The viewpoint of the commentators can be faulted on the grounds that they failed to offer any persuasive explanation of this part of the same Quranic verse, had it not been for a previous decree from Allah. This could mean either the divine decree in eternity, which determines all that will happen, or God's decree in eternity to make the spoils of war lawful for the Muslims. Now, it is evident that it is unlawful to take anything from someone else. It has been declared lawful according to revealed law. Hence, were the above view to be accepted, it would mean that all, including the Prophet, peace be upon him, had committed a sin. Such an interpretation can hardly be entertained, especially since this view is dependent on the authority of isolated ahad traditions. In my opinion, in order to understand the above verse, it should be borne in mind that preliminary instructions about war had already been given in Surah Muhammad, which was revealed before the Battle of Badr. Therefore, when you meet the unbelievers in fight, smite at their necks. At length, when you have thoroughly subdued them, bind a bond firmly on them. Thereafter, either resort to generosity or to ransom until the war lays down its burden. Muhammad 47:4. This verse had already made it lawful for the Muslims to hold the enemy in captivity or to accept ransom contingent on the total suppression of the enemy. The Muslims had, therefore, acted in accordance with the permission granted by God to accept ransom. However, in so doing, they had neglected the stipulation that the enemy should be fully subdued before the acceptance of ransom. While the Quraysh army was retreating, many Muslims took to collecting the spoils and taking the unbelievers as captives. It was only a few Muslims who chased the fleeing enemy. Had the Muslims made a concerted pursuit, a death blow could have been struck at the Quraysh power once and for all. God therefore expressed his disapproval of this manner of dealing with the situation, as the above quoted verse suggests. It is obvious that it is not the Prophet, peace be upon him, but the generality of Muslims at whom the reproach is directed. The purpose of the verse is to impress upon the Muslims that they had not yet imbibed the mission of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Prophets are not concerned with filling their coffers with spoils and ransom money. Rather, their mission is to crush the power of the unbelievers. This was not the first instance when the Muslims had showed their worldliness. They had earlier expressed their preference to raid the trade caravan to fighting against the Quraysh army. Then, rather than try to crush the enemy, they turned to collecting spoils and taking captives, and later remonstrated about the distribution of booty. Had it not been that God had granted them permission to accept ransom, see Muhammad 47:4, he would have severely punished them on that count. God, however, was merciful to them and permitted them to enjoy whatever they had seized. They should therefore refrain from behavior which might be displeasing to God. It is pertinent to point out that Jassas, in his Ahkam al-Quran, considers the above view a plausible interpretation of the verse. Ibn Hisham also contains a report which supports the view. The report mentions that while the Muslims were engaged in seizing captives of war and collecting booty, the Prophet, peace be upon him, observed signs of disapproval on the face of Sa'd bin Mu'adh. The Prophet, peace be upon him, asked him, "O Sa'd, it appears that you do not approve of the behavior of these people." He replied, "Yes, O Messenger of God, it is the first encounter in which God has caused the rout of the unbelievers. This opportunity should have been better utilized for crushing the unbelievers thoroughly rather than for amassing captives of war."
يا أيها النبي قل لمن في أيديكم من الأسرى إن يعلم الله في قلوبكم خيرا يؤتكم خيرا مما أخذ منكم ويغفر لكم والله غفور رحيم.
O Prophet, say to the captives in your hands, if Allah finds any goodness in your hearts, He will give you that which is better than what has been taken away from you, and He will forgive you. Allah is ever forgiving, most merciful.
وَإِن يُرِيدُوا خِيَانَتَكَ فَقَدْ خَانُوا اللَّهَ مِن قَبْلُ فَأَمْكَنَ مِنْهُمْ وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ حَكِيمٌ.
But if they seek to betray you, know that they had already betrayed Allah. Therefore, He made you prevail over them. Allah is all-knowing, all-wise.
إن الذين آمنوا وهاجروا وجاهدوا بأموالهم وأنفسهم في سبيل الله والذين آووا ونصروا أولئك بعضهم أولياء بعض والذين آمنوا ولم يهاجروا ما لكم من ولايتهم من شيء حتى يهاجروا وإن استنصروكم في الدين فعليكم النصر إلا على قوم بينكم وبينهم ميثاق والله بما تعملون بصير.
Surely, those who believed and migrated and strove hard in the way of Allah with their possessions and their lives, and those that sheltered and helped them, they alone are the true allies of one another. And those who believed but did not migrate to Dar al-Islam, you are under no obligation of alliance unless they migrate. And should they seek help from you in the matter of religion, it is incumbent on you to provide help unless it be against a people with whom you have a pact. Allah is cognizant of all that you do. You are under no obligation of alliance unless they migrate.
The above verse is an important provision in Islamic constitutional law. for it prescribes that any agreement on guardianship would be applicable exclusively to Muslims who are either the original inhabitants of the territory, which has become Dar al-Islam, the domain of Islam, or Muslims who have migrated to the Dar al-Islam. As to Muslims living outside the jurisdiction of the Islamic State, the bond of religious brotherhood would doubtlessly exist between them and Muslim residents of the Islamic State. The two groups, however, would not have the relationship of walaya, mutual alliance. Likewise, a walaya relationship would not exist between Muslims who do not migrate to Dar al-Islam, but come to it as Muslim subjects of a non-Muslim state. The Arabic word walaya denotes the relationship of kinship, support, succor, protection, friendship, and guardianship. In the context of the present verse, the word signifies the relationship of mutual support between the Islamic State and its citizens, and between the citizens themselves. Thus, this verse lays down that in a political and constitutional sense, only those Muslims who live within the territorial boundaries of the Islamic State will enjoy the privileges of walaya, guardianship of the Islamic State. As for Muslims who are settled in a non-Islamic state, they are excluded from its political and constitutional guardianship. It is difficult to spell out in detail the implications of this rule. Just to give some idea of it, it should be pointed out that because they lack guardianship, the Muslims of Darul Kufr, the domain of unbelief, cannot inherit the property of a deceased Muslim in the Islamic State. Nor may they act as guardians of Muslim citizens of an Islamic state. Nor is it lawful for a matrimonial contract to be made between Muslims, one of whom is living in an Islamic state and the other outside of it. Likewise, the Islamic State may not appoint to an office of authority those who have not surrendered their citizenship of the non-Islamic state. Above all, those provisions of Islamic law determine the foreign policy of the Islamic State. Since this clause restricts the role and control of the Islamic State over Muslims living within that state, the Islamic State is not obliged to look after the Muslims outside its domain. The following tradition embodies this point. I am acquit of every Muslim living among the polytheists. Islamic law therefore strikes at the root cause of the conflict which bedevils the relationship between different nations. For whenever a state tries to champion the cause of the minority living outside its territory, it gives rise to intricate problems which cannot be resolved even by a succession of wars.
It is incumbent on you to provide help, unless it be against a people with whom you have a pact.
The above verse makes it clear that the Muslims living outside the Islamic State have no political bond with the Islamic State. This verse, however, does emphasize that those Muslims are not free of the bond of religious brotherhood. If Muslims living in a non-Islamic state are persecuted and seek help from the Islamic State or its citizens, it is incumbent upon the latter to help the persecuted Muslims. While helping one's brethren in faith, the Muslims are expected to act scrupulously. This help should be rendered without violating international obligations and with due regard to the requirements of moral propriety. If the Islamic State happens to be bound in a treaty relationship with a nation which inflicts wrong on Muslims, the oppressed Muslims will not be helped in a manner which is inconsistent with the moral obligations incumbent on the Islamic State as a result of that treaty. The Quran uses the word mithaq for treaty. This expression is a derivative of an Arabic word which stands for trust and confidence. The expression therefore implies that the two parties trust each other, that there is no difference between them irrespective of whether a no-war agreement has been formally concluded or not. The actual words of the verse, بَيْنَكُمْ وَبَيْنَهُمْ مِيثَاقٌ, unless there be a pact between you and them, make it plain that the treaty concluded by the Islamic State with a non-Muslim state does not merely bind the two governments. The moral obligations arising from that treaty are binding upon the Muslim nation as a whole, including its individuals, not to violate the obligations of the treaty into which an Islamic state has entered with some other state. However, it is only the Muslims of the Islamic State who are bound by the agreement signed by the Islamic State. Muslims living outside the Islamic State have no such obligations. This accounts for the fact that Abu Basir and Abu Jandal were not bound by the Hudaybiyah treaty concluded between the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the Meccan unbelievers.
والذين كفروا بعضهم أولياء بعض إلا تفعلوه تكن فتنة في الأرض وفساد كبير.
And those who disbelieve, they are allies of one another. And unless you act likewise, there will be oppression in the world and great corruption. There will be oppression in the world and great corruption.
If the words, unless you also help one another, in the verse are regarded as a continuation of the preceding verse, they would mean that if Muslims do not support each other in the way unbelievers do, this would give rise to much mischief and disorder in the world. However, if these words are considered to be connected with the directives embodied in verse 72 onwards, their purpose would be to emphasize that the world would become full of mischief and disorder if the Muslims of Dar al-Islam A. failed to help one another, B. failed to provide political support and protection to the Muslims who have settled down in non-Islamic states and have not migrated to Dar al-Islam, C. failed to help the Muslims living under oppression in territories outside Dar al-Islam when they ask for it, and D. failed to sever their friendly ties with the unbelievers.
والذين آمنوا وهاجروا وجاهدوا في سبيل الله والذين آووا ونصروا أولئك هم المؤمنون حقا لهم مغفرة ورزق كريم.
Those who believe and have migrated and strove in the way of Allah, and those who gave them refuge and help, it is they who are the true believers. Theirs shall be forgiveness and honorable sustenance.
والذين آمنوا من بعد وهاجروا وجاهدوا معكم فأولئك منكم وأولو الأرحام بعضهم أولى ببعض في كتاب الله إن الله بكل شيء عليم.
And those who believed afterwards and migrated and strove along with you, they belong to you. But those related by blood are nearer to one another according to the book of Allah. Allah has knowledge of everything. But those related by blood are nearer to one another according to the book of Allah.
The purpose of the verse is to make it clear that the basis of inheritance is blood relationship and marriage rather than the mere bond of Islamic brotherhood. What occasioned this statement was the misunderstanding which had arisen after migration to Medina, when the Prophet, peace be upon him, established fraternal relations between the Ansar and the Muhajirun and made pairs of them, declaring that they were brothers of each